This is the River Thames, and it's seen a lot of history. At one time, British kings and queens would have been rowed up and down this river past where I'm standing now. Often the history of monarchs can seem like one long series of facts, but history is about trying to understand the personalities and the motivations of the people behind the crown. And to do that, we need some sources.
Take Elizabeth I, for example. She became queen in 1558 and is celebrated for a glorious reign lasting 44 years. But what made Elizabeth tick? To find out, we'll examine two sources that portray very different sides of her character.
Where better to start than one of Elizabeth I's great seals? We have one here and it's beautifully preserved, it's in fantastic condition. Now, all monarchs would have had these. They're their official image, the image they want to project to people.
Great seals were attached to important documents. They were made out of beeswax from a special mould, so they were extremely difficult to forge.
If we take a closer look, we can see that in her hands she's holding an orb and a sceptre. Now, the orb represents her spiritual power, her God-given power, if you like, and the sceptre represents her power on earth, so her power over laws, over her army. This source from 1586 shows Elizabeth I at the height of her power. In this image, she's an all-powerful ruler, anointed by God. But was this always the case? Are there other sources which can tell us more about Elizabeth, the real person? If we delve further into the archive, we find a very different source connected to Elizabeth.
It's a letter she wrote in 1554, when she was only 20, to her elder half-sister, Mary Tudor. Mary had recently become queen.
This is a beautifully preserved source. It's 400 years old and it's Elizabeth's personal writing. What's really lovely about this is it's from the time before she became queen, and so it's allowing us to see a side of Elizabeth that we don't normally get to see. And at this point, Elizabeth is in prison. She's been put there because there's been suspicions that she's been involved in a plot to overthrow Mary. And so she's fearing for her life. She's worried that she's going to be executed.
This source is one of the most important letters Elizabeth ever wrote, because it may well have saved her life.
She says, "I humbly beseech your majesty to verify it in me,
and to remember your last promise and my last demand, that I not be condemned without answer, which it seems that now I am."
So she's saying very respectfully, but quite assertively, you promised me that I'd be able to speak to you, that I'd be able to give some sort of defence. And as we go through the letter, we see that she gets more demanding and perhaps a little bit more desperate as well.
Elizabeth was in such deep trouble because of a plot to overthrow Queen Mary. Elizabeth was rumoured to have links with one of the ringleaders, Thomas Wyatt.
So she writes, "I humbly crave to speak with your highness.
And as for the traitor Wyatt, he might peradventure write me a letter, but on my faith I never received any from him."
He might have wrote a letter to her, but she didn't receive it. So she's categorically denying any involvement in a plot to overthrow Mary. The actual way the letter's put together is very interesting, because we've got these lines across the page here, and it appears that Elizabeth has done this in order to stop anybody adding anything else onto the letter to make it look like she's saying something that she hasn't said. So this really gives us a sense of Tudor politics and the dangers at the time.
It's hardly surprising she didn't trust anyone. After all, her father, Henry VIII, had executed her mother, Anne Boleyn, when Elizabeth was just 2 years old.
The two very different sources we've looked at show us completely different sides to Elizabeth. Haunted by how close she came to death in 1554 when she wrote the Tide Letter, when Elizabeth came to power, she was determined to make sure that she wasn't going to be threatened again. And you can see this desire in the Great Seal, which highlights a monarch who wants to portray herself as all-powerful.